Half of a degree. Doesn't sound like much, does it? When you tweak your heating at home by half a degree, it doesn't feel very different. But for our planet, where life has depended on a stable climate for millennia, half a degree Celsius is a very big deal. Every fraction of a degree matters, especially to nature, already under pressure. For instance, the warmer the world gets, the more coffee suffers from heat and disease. 100 million people could lose their incomes, and billions of us will also lose our favourite drink. The hotter the world becomes, the harder things get for our pollinator friends. Already damaged by pesticides and disease, overheating could be the last straw for many of our vital bumblebee species. For emperor penguins, the world's biggest penguin is also one of the most vulnerable. They depend on Antarctic fast ice, so if global temperatures continue to rise as they are today, emperor penguin populations could decline dramatically, whereas 1.5 would secure their future. We've already lost half the planet's tropical reefs in just the past 30 years. Even if the world warms by only 1.5 degrees, that's enough to kill anywhere between 70 to 90%. But at 2 degrees, it's likely that all warm water coral reefs will die. Already vulnerable, snow leopards are seeing their habitat shrink as their snowy landscape warms up. As their food supplies get low, they turn more to livestock, bringing greater conflict with local people. The 6 years since the Paris Climate Change Agreement have been the hottest ever recorded. The more we delay cutting greenhouse gas emissions, the higher the risk for people and nature. We know the 1.5 degree target won't be easy. It will require huge changes to energy and farming and the way we all live our lives. That's why we need a bold, clear, urgent commitment to 1.5 degrees.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk, the hidden side of climate change, an event organised by the Balanced Community. My name is Vera van Gol, and today I'm joined by Isabella O'Dowd, the head of climate change at our partner World Wildlife Fund for Nature, WWF, Bronwyn Claire, climate science lead at Ortec Finance, and our colleague Paddy Arber, Head of Government Engagement on Sustainability at Aviva. Welcome to everyone. Thank you all very much for being here.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, really nice to be here.
We hope to have an opportunity for you to ask the questions as the audience. So please start sending them in through the Ask a Question tab. Tell us your name, where you are, and what the weather's like. Hopefully no extreme weather events where you are, and we'll aim to get to them a little later. Now, we dive into today's topic. Climate change is increasingly affecting us all, but it's becoming ever clearer that we are not all impacted equally. People who are already more vulnerable to changes in society will be the hardest hit, as climate change exacerbates underlying inequities. The focus of today is on how climate change is more adversely impacting women around the world. Can you each tell me a little bit about why that's important to you as a topic?
Yeah, so, climate change is something I'm really passionate about. I've worked and studied it for many years, and I think kind of looking at the future and the extreme weather that we're seeing at the moment, particularly this summer, has been terrifying in terms of kind of the extreme heat we've seen in many places around the world. We know the evidence is really clear that women are more proportionally affected by climate change, whether that's kind of impacts from extreme weather or in the household level, or even kind of risk in terms of their health and safety. So as someone that's kind of working in policy and climate change, I'm really kind of passionate that we make sure we incorporate these issues into the policy design and make sure that we're kind of addressing them and making sure we're picking policies that help reduce that impact as we kind of move into that world of more extreme heat.
So, yeah, if I go next, I think for me, it's moved from probably what was initially a bit theoretical and professional. So before joining Aviva, I worked for the government for many years. I helped on the negotiations team for the Paris Agreement for the UK government and also on the Sustainable Development Goals. So I've always been really interested and passionate about climate change. But then 4 years ago, my daughter was born, and I think that really brought home to me the real life impacts, both on the climate side and on the gender inequality side. And we'll talk about the connection between the two. But for me, this little cute bundle, looking at her back in 2019 when she was born, I was thinking, God, in 2050, which up until then had just been a kind of theoretical date we were all aiming at, she was only going to be like 30. She, hopefully will still be alive in 2100, where we're going to start to see, what a 1.5 degree or a 2 degree world, hopefully a 1.5 degree or even worse, look like. And so for me, that just meant like double down on this. The theory and the professional aspect were important, but actually it's about real people here, now, and all around the world as well. Yeah, so that's me.
For me personally, it's also about the legacy. So for me, the stories I grew up with are about, so I'm from Australia, so of those pioneer women who came out into the landscape, were dealing with a difficult climate and looking to find their own place and build resilience and homes. And so that's a story I want to be able to continue on for my own family and our own history. I will admit working with the Indigenous people in Australia would be also a definite way to make that process better. But I think being able to think to the stories that we want to leave behind us as well, and how we want to carry our legacy forward has been one of my really strong motivators.
Oh, brilliant. All very strong personal motivations. Thank you. And we'll go into more detail on each of your sort of interests in this space as well in a little later on. So why does gender matter? We've already touched a little bit on this, but let's start with some stats. Women and children are shown to be 14 times more likely to die than men during natural disasters. We're going to see higher rates of climate-induced food shortage and famine, and with women being responsible for between 60 and 80% of the food production in the developing world, this leads to women carrying a disproportionate burden. In addition, 70% of the 1.3 billion of people in the developing world living below the poverty line are women. With climate change likely to accentuate the gaps between the world's rich and poor, women in developing countries constitute one of the poorest and most disadvantaged groups in society, more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So I'll come to you first, Paddy, if that's okay. Can you open up a little bit about what Aviva has been doing in this area and why?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I wanted to sort of build on what you were saying, Bronwyn, because I suppose, and without wanting to be too cheesy about it, at Aviva, we do see that we have a kind of corporate legacy as well as a personal legacy. And in my experience, I've worked here with quite a few CEOs now, and they genuinely do see that. And maybe we'll talk a bit about stewardship later on, but see themselves as stewards of the company. So, we can trace back our history over, I think it's over 300 years. And so for the leadership, they want to see that legacy, and that manifests itself in different ways depending on, what the CEOs and the leaderships are interested in at any given time. And so back in 2021, there were two kind of parallel tracks going on that we were looking at with Amanda, obviously our current CEO, was both the government's Women in Finance champion, which was about championing gender equality, particularly in financial services and particularly in the UK. But also we were having an increasingly strong presence and influence on climate change. And of course, that was the year that we were going to see COP26 in Glasgow. So Amanda asked if we could bring those strands together, because we were already hearing about some of the things that you've just talked about, Vera, that kind of intersection between gender inequality and climate change, and how climate change exacerbates gender inequality. And so building on the model of what Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, did in politics, Amanda decided, could we do something like that for women in business and finance to have a voice on climate change? And so she brought together this amazing group of business leaders, NGOs, actually including Tanya, the CEO of WWF UK, politicians, regulators, so like this incredible group of really inspirational women, to try and put their collective brainpower together and say, look, what can we as a group of senior influential women do to give women a voice in this discussion? And we did a really impactful report on this issue, where we unpacked the issue of gender inequality, both in developed countries and in the developing world, and what we could do about it. And they had a really brilliant event where Amanda brought that group together at COP26 to talk about, including again Tanya, what was happening around the world, how were women both being hit by climate change, but also increasingly being like a massive part of the solution, and really inspirational stories from women in Africa, women who'd been affected by flooding here in the UK. And then we've just taken that work and built on it over the last few years. So this year we launched a kind of a paper on metrics and investment in gender and climate change with Oliver Wyman. And yeah, really just trying to use our influence for good to help create that kind of legacy. And I think I hope it's something that will continue in Aviva, and also that we can be kind of proud of ultimately.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. The concept of Amanda as being a steward to the planet as part of Aviva, I think, is a wonderful.
I think we'd be a lot better off if Amanda was the steward of the planet.
Yes.
But we do what we can.
We'll circle back to that topic a little bit later as well as Indigenous voices. So, two of the main frameworks used to think about sustainability and addressing global issues like climate change are the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, or more familiar within the financial world, ESG decision making, i.e. considering environmental, social and governance aspects in making choices. To a layperson, the issues that these frameworks try to address may appear to be separate, but it's arguably that they are inextricably linked. So Bronwyn, I'll come to you on this. In this context, intersectionality is a term frequently used. What does that mean? And why might that be important in the context of climate change?
Okay, so I'll start with a bit of a definition. So intersectionality refers to the interconnected nature of social categorisation. So we're looking at things like race, gender, class, and other factors that may be visible or not, or hidden themselves, which create overlapping and independent systems of discrimination and disadvantage. So there's often a layering to these. Sometimes people fit into multiple categories, but it means that they're also then being sort of multiplied in terms of the social support systems may not be present for them, and then when, say, adversity happens, such as climate, flooding events or the like, then it's a much greater impact for them. So the SDGs are a really helpful framework. They're 17 interlinked global goals. So they're a blueprint essentially for what we would like to achieve by 2030. They're quite, I would say, definitely a reach for business and for government. And whilst an individual business might look at them and go, okay, this is actually an awful lot for me to take on, they do think I give you a helpful lens and a starting point. You might look at one like SDG 5, which is about gender equality, and use that as a lens to think about, okay, what can we as a business do? Where are we having impact in the community? What are the most valuable points that we can add? And then work that into, say, investment decisions if you're an investor, or into the way your business operates and how they recruit people or how they work their operations. So then taking it from those big picture items in the SDGs into how do we make business decisions and apply ourselves in our day-to-day work in a more thoughtful manner. I can add a few extra points just also on how that interconnectedness may sort of play in with climate. I just wanted to mention a few particularly. So one is about that disproportional impact that you were saying about how there's those multiple layers, which essentially mean that someone becomes even more vulnerable than you might have, say, through one piece. You're picking up these multiple amplifying negative impacts. And then just really putting them at a disadvantage, which is often building on, say, like being under-resourced, or you don't have a certain access, lack of political representation, and really your own sort of decision-making power. If you've lost your sort of authority over yourself, that can be really just destroying to how you then are able to cope with other disasters that come along. So really what we need to look for in that sense is then sort of the inclusive solutions, the ones that are more holistic and cover sort of environmental justice. So you can bring those voices in, and the solutions themselves aren't then continuing those systemic disadvantages, that you're able to bring things back into the round again and really provide more holistic solutions.
Oh, thank you. I think that really sets out how it's all interconnected. Thank you very much for explaining that. And we've already touched a little bit on the Indigenous voices, so I'll come to that next, actually. So the latest climate science is showing us that we're already locked into a difficult future. We'll likely see temperatures rise well above 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, unfortunately, which will result in crop failures, decline in crucial species, and increased risks of damage by flooding and storms. Despite climate change being a global issue, these effects are going to be felt locally, of course, and will require a response at that level. So Isabella, if I come to you first, what role do you see local and Indigenous, and perhaps specifically women's knowledge, play in adapting to these climate change impacts?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, local and Indigenous knowledge is essential in terms of how we tackle climate change, but also how we adapt. I think, the scale at which we need to transition to a 1.5 world and also the impacts that we're already experiencing, making sure we work really kind of on that local level is really important. And Indigenous women in particular have been at the forefront of a lot of environmental conservation and have really invaluable knowledge and expertise that can help build resilience, but also help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And women in particular, you listed some of the many reasons why women are more impacted by climate change. And for me, that's kind of one of the main reasons why women's knowledge is so important in how we adapt to climate change. Climate action requires 100% of the population. We need to make sure everyone is included. Empowering women often means sort of better climate solutions. I think you kind of set out how much 60 to 80% of women are involved in kind of food production, but half of agricultural labour force in developing countries are also predominantly women. So empowering women in agriculture can also have a really positive impact on adapting and, I suppose, mitigating climate change. Women are also really key roles within communities to help build resilience. They're often the first response in natural disasters. So the more that we can kind of provide education and knowledge and that crisis management and integrate women into that situation, the more resilient communities can get to adapting to climate change. And I think another big reason, which we've mentioned already, but climate change affects us all, but it doesn't affect us equally. So we know that women are often more vulnerable to extreme weather, and these impacts are kind of making the inequalities even more extreme. So women often face higher risk and greater burdens from the impacts of climate change. So I think it's really essential that we address women and also make sure we have really strong Indigenous and local knowledge when we're looking at these issues. And not only do we then sort of address the climate crisis, but we're also helping to address gender equality and empowering those women. So yeah, I think it's really important.
Oh, thank you. And the empowerment we'll circle back to a little later on as well, just making sure everyone's got that voice around the table when decisions are made. Bronwyn, in your opening, you already talked about your interest in working with Indigenous people. So we know Ortec Finance has explored people's lived experiences of climate change and done qualitative research through methods of storytelling. What has this brought to light, and why are these stories so important?
So for me, it's bringing those marginalised voices into the investment decision. So we support investors to understand their scenarios of the future that's possibly going to be there. And those wider voices really need to be included. So you also need to listen to them. So it's about how do you engage that? Is it through the sort of the standard modelling approaches that you're taking, but also how do you bring in, say, alternative viewpoints? Do you bring in sort of those stories as narratives or that sit alongside? Are you also engaging maybe through your investors actually to discuss the assets themselves? So can you get down to the grassroots of who's living in those, so say real estate assets, who's in those communities that surround them? And I think the other piece that would be is really helpful is understanding that broader context. What's the economy around those assets doing? Is that something that you're comfortable with promoting?
We already talked about empowerment and giving women more of a voice in decision making. So for matters where women and girls are affected disproportionately, it is arguably even more important to give them a voice. Major decisions with regards to global climate action are being made at the United Nations Conference of Parties, or COP. And Paddy, you've been to COP a few times. What is it like, and how well, or not well, is gender represented at COP?
Yeah, so I've been to my fair share of COPs now. So both as a sort of government official back from sort of about 2010 to about 2015, and then since coming to Aviva as well, representing Aviva. And I'd say, yeah, it is disproportionate in terms of gender equality in the COP. So it varies from country to country, but I think typically they do measure the statistics for these things now, and I think typically it's only about 30% of the delegates, so the formal negotiators who are there to negotiate the overall climate change agreements, only around 30% of those delegates are women, 70% men. That's even worse in the case of some countries. It's better in the case of others. The UK actually does fairly well in terms of the gender equality of its delegation. But then the statistics get even worse when you look at who within those delegations are doing the actual speaking and who are leading the delegation. So then the stats fall even further. So actually the so-called heads of delegation, so the sort of the most senior representatives of that government, I think only 20% are women to 80% men. And that's the case even for the most recent COP. So it really is, it's pretty shocking, particularly as you say, when there's all these other statistics showing that it's women who are disproportionately affected. And that was something that we tried to bring a bit of a spotlight to when we did the events with Amanda and the other Women in Finance Climate Action Group. And I think, they've started measuring these statistics annually now. And I think they are sort of creeping very slowly upwards, but it is very slowly. And they kind of represent broader gender inequalities in society as a whole. So just in preparation for this event, I did a little bit of Googling to sort of see what the latest stats were. And there's actually a really impressive but depressing study that the UN just brought out on gender inequality across all of the SDGs. It's came out last week. It's worth a look. And that brings out that, these kind of 20, 30% figures actually, they're very reflective of society as a whole. So it was saying it's roughly 20 to 30% of parliamentarians across the world are women, 20 to 30% of local councillors, 20 to 30% of senior business leaders. So yeah, it's like a societal issue that then carries through into the climate negotiations in a really, unhelpful way. But I think the more that, organisations like Aviva and Ortec and WWF can shine a light on it, as well as doing something about it ourselves and within our own industries, that is us kind of trying to do our bit. And then, that gives us more authority to then be able to go out to governments and other organisations and say, well, look, we're trying to do our best here, but what else can we do and what could you do as well?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And you mentioned in your opening that it's particularly of personal importance to you because of your 4-year-old daughter. It's really bringing it home how important it is to move forward in this space.
Yeah, I mean, it's very cheesy, isn't it? And it's sort of like, typical oblivious male just sort of say, oh, well, I didn't realise any of this stuff happened until I had my daughter. But it is true, I look at the world differently now. And I've sort of given this example before, but even just things like reading her stories every evening, like how many of the central characters are male rather than female. And again, that's getting a bit better with modern books, but traditional books, not so much. Films, like thinking of showing her all my favourite films that I liked growing up. And particularly in the past, just the default is male, right? Like the default everything is male. And in this summer of Barbie, that's not a very original point to make, but it was certainly one that struck me. And so that connection between, thinking of the future in terms of the environment and the planet as a whole, but also looking at it through the eyes of my daughter, who will experience the world in a different way to me. I think those two things have helped me connect a little bit more. I hope I'm less oblivious than I was before.
You certainly don't sound oblivious, so you're all good. And you mentioned Barbie. Have you seen it?
I have seen it. My wife and I, for our 10th wedding anniversary,
That's brilliant.
we took one of our first sort of afternoons off together and went to see Barbie, and we both enjoyed it. A few tears may have been shed by both of us. But anyway, I won't go there. It's not a film review show.
That's very good.
Worth seeing for anyone in the audience who hasn't got it yet.
I agree. All right. So, Isabella, the natural world is starting to have a bit more of an amplified voice at the biodiversity COPs, which people might not be familiar with. How can we ensure that it keeps a seat around the table like we were discussing for women, and why is that important?
Yeah, so I mean, nature and biodiversity are really core to tackling climate change, and it needs to be front and centre of climate negotiations and climate action. I think we're seeing more and more over the last few years, but yeah, definitely much more that needs to be done around nature. And at WWF, we're really trying to kind of bend the curve on nature degradation. So not just halting that, but making sure we're really restoring that as well. And nature has a really important role to play in climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And it's also often the one that's sort of first interacts with the impacts of climate change. So too much water causes flooding, too little water causes drought. I suppose the natural system is really at the heart of that. And it's kind of our first line defence. So we know that restoring and protecting coastal mangrove forests can really help the impacts of storms and tidal surges, which are coming more and more common. We know that planting trees really helps with flooding, and there's lots of ways in which nature can help offer solutions to climate change. And yeah, environments that are already degraded and damaged are less resilient to the impacts of climate change. So we need to make sure we've got really good management systems, and women are often really at the heart of that in terms of kind of the role that they play and the knowledge that they can provide. And I think kind of when we look at sort of, I suppose nature is one of the most best value for money options that we can use as, you know, it's a natural resource, and it has that kind of win-win of restoring and managing wetlands and river basins is the cheapest way of kind of making sure there's fresh water in downstream cities, and I suppose kind of investing in the natural infrastructure is far cheaper and has many more benefits than investing in hard infrastructure. So we can have that really positive co-benefit around livelihood, climate change and nature, the kind of triple challenge that we often refer to at WWF around making sure, you know, we think around climate, nature and people and how those things, all come together.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so on to the next topic. Mark Versey, the CEO of Aviva Investors, appeared on Deborah Meaden's show, the Big Green, or it's called the Big Green Money Show, and said that the choices that we make about how we invest our pension pots will have about 21 times more of an impact than any lifestyle choices we may make, like driving less or going vegan. So the good we do with our pension pots, I think particularly relevant as a business like Aviva, is very important. So the financial sector, however, still suffers from female underrepresentation in decision-making positions. Bronwyn, how can we ensure that marginalised voices are being heard for investment decisions, and why might that be important in the light of climate change?
Okay. I'm going to start by just saying the obvious. We need to listen to them. Yeah. I think often those voices have been excluded from the debate and how things are framed. So I think we need to be much more inclusive in when we're thinking of who are our stakeholders, who is the return, and how do we define sort of value and return is also, I think, a really important concept, is that people want to engage more with that broader understanding of value rather than simply thinking about their pension pot being a financial return. It's also part of a society and an economy, and how is it engaging. So very much supportive of that 21 times point. And I think the ways we engage with there are a lot more options now. So community forums, it doesn't have to be sort of beating the feet on the ground. There's a lot more online options to being able to engage with people, but also partnerships with local organisations. I think WWF is a perfect example of those global networks where they've got local roots that you're able to reach into and understand how are the assets or the economies that you're supporting through, say, what equities you're investing in, what bonds and markets, what government and sovereign pieces of investment that are also being made, how that's connecting down to the communities that they support and how that's being integrated. So I'd also really like to mention that I think those marginalised voices can also bring alternative, innovative ideas on how you can finance things as well. So when you're an investor, you're often sort of thinking of those standard things that I just mentioned, like equities or bonds, but really there's a lot of microfinancing options, there's a lot of alternative asset backing, there's partnerships with government that might be available. So I think it's also about investors being a little bit brave in how they engage and how they bring those voices and those innovations in and step out of what might be sort of standard products and provide support to some alternative options as well.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. I think we talk a lot about diversity of thought in Aviva being really important to bring that in when we're talking about diversity, inclusion and equity. So I think that's what you say that we need to pursue more in investments as well. Yeah.
It also makes us more transparent, I think, because a lot of what, say, the discussion around disclosure from investors and what information they're sharing, it's also about them being transparent and accountable. So if you're able to talk to how you've engaged with the broader stakeholder group and then feed that information back out, it's a much more sort of affirmative cycle and able to give that sort of permission for and encouragement to the investments to also continue in that avenue.
Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you. We touched a little bit on stewardship earlier, Paddy. So I've got a question actually for Isabella. For now, stewardship is a concept that's often mentioned in a call to care more for our planet. So what does it mean if we go into more detail there, and what merit does the concept hold in relation to climate action?
Yes, so I suppose stewardship, what does it mean? It's the careful and responsible management of something in one's care, and I suppose how our stewardship of the natural world leaves much to be desired at the moment, and we're failing to use natural resources responsibly and carefully with the devastating consequences that we're seeing around the world. And I suppose climate change is the result of the way that we fuel our economies, driven by political and economic decisions that have been based on not so wise, I suppose, stewardship, even when kind of clear and compelling evidence shows the impact that we're having on climate change and the failure to act, I suppose, with the speed and urgency that we need to see to meet and deliver that 1.5 degree world that we've talked about. So I suppose if we used and we applied the concept of stewardship to guide decision making and make choices around how we fuel economies, that would be a very powerful step in terms of kind of initially addressing that. And all economies ultimately depend on the resources from the natural environment provide. So the atmosphere, water, soils, fuels, timber and metals, and all the goods that we produce and trade ultimately rely on natural resources. So sustainable management or good stewardship of those resources makes good economic sense, and yet in the case of natural assets, it's kind of not been managed sustainably, and the current kind of economic system puts a lot of emphasis on GDP growth and is pushing that kind of natural system that we rely on towards kind of those dangerous tipping points. So climate change, pollution, water shortages, land degradation are all a kind of consequence of the economic system that takes for granted and fails to value those nature and natural resources. So in other words, a system that is not based on good stewardship. So I think kind of how we frame that and how we try and build that into kind of core business models or governments or how we kind of make sure nature and climate are at the heart of that is really important.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we'll go into this in a little bit more detail in a moment, but is it maybe also to do with the people who make the decisions on how to spend on natural resources at the moment are not hit as much by the consequences of that? Do you reckon?
Yeah. And I suppose the evidence and the science couldn't be clearer, I think, now, and yet we're not kind of moving and making those changes at the scale that we need to. And I suppose there's that kind of short-term benefit to some degree, but ultimately, we are moving to a point where there's, the cost of inaction and the cost of these extreme weathers and the impact that we're having on the natural world is going to be far more than, if we don't act now. Yeah. So, really important.
Thank you. Bronwyn and Paddy, to build on the concept of stewardship, what does this concept mean in terms of the private finance sector?
I suppose I'd build on what I was saying earlier about how clients see value, and I think it's really important for investors to actually start to ask the client base, the benefactors, the beneficiaries of either long-term pension products or insurance or sort of like family wealth, how do you want that to be invested? Sort of what sort of world do you want to be creating at the end? Because that's something they can factor into the investments that they're then making then. Once you give them that sort of that power and that permission and encouragement to consider other factors, those ESG ones or broader the SDGs. If you're able to kind of encourage them in those sorts of terminology, they can take it into the decision-making process much more clearly, and also step into some of those other spaces like direct engagement or voting. There's a lot of other options available to investors as well in how they place your money, but also then how they deal with the investment industry. Are they going to join and be part of, say, policy engagement discussions, part of the COP system, and that encouragement from the customers that they hold is the biggest signal for them, I think, on active engagement.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that makes total sense to me. And I think it's I liked, your definition, Isabella, of stewardship as careful and responsible management of something in one's care. Because I think that when asset managers and investors do their jobs well, that's exactly what they're trying to do as well. But I think that I've certainly noticed, even in the sort of, in the time that I've been working for Aviva, there's been a really interesting and, in my view, quite positive shift in terms of our own definition of stewardship within the investment management industry. And you sort of covered it too, Bronwyn, where I think maybe initially it was seen quite narrowly as you are the stewards of the companies in which you invest. So you take out an equity stake in a company, and you're therefore basically trying to ensure through your engagement with that company that it carries itself in the right way, that its governance procedures are correct, that it's not going to do anything that means you lose money for your investors. But then, over time, I think that's been expanded to understand that actually there's a connection between that type of stewardship and the broader stewardship that Isabella was covering, which is actually the performance of that company is very much contingent upon and itself can influence the external environment in which it operates. And so that's why we've seen this growth in kind of ESG and trying to look at more than just the sort of financial performance or governance of a company. And now something that's even more exciting, which I think, Aviva Investors is actually really good at, and, no credit to me for this. This is absolutely all Aviva Investors' work, is this concept of macro stewardship. So if you define micro stewardship as the stewardship of the firm and the activities of a firm, of a corporate, well, actually, as Bronwyn was saying, large investors are also very heavily invested in countries as a whole, right? Like we lend a lot of money to countries through sovereign bonds. And so the concept is that you should be active in your stewardship of the countries and the wider external environment, because ultimately that, we all depend on that, just as Isabella was saying, for everything else that happens. And so that's something that I think, hopefully more investors like Ortec and Aviva Investors, that will become part of a wider movement. So macro stewardship as well as micro stewardship, looking after the world as well as looking after individual companies.
Yeah. To stick with that topic, macro stewardship and the kind of responsibility that comes with investing, and if you hold the decision-making power around investments, etc., there's maybe a certain responsibility we carry towards the underdeveloped world or the developing world. So Isabella, what do you believe the role should be of the developed countries in helping build climate resilience in developing countries?
So I think, first of all, leading the way in reducing their own emissions to minimise future climate impacts. So a lot of the developed world has, I suppose, contributed significantly to the impacts of climate change. And I think sort of really core of that is we know that nationally determined contributions, which are countries' plans to meet the climate commitments, are not on track at the moment globally to meet that 1.5 degrees of warming. So yeah, I think really starting at home in those developed countries, making sure that they're really doing everything they can to reduce their own emissions. Then I think financing is really key. Reducing their own emissions, but also their footprint. I think that's really important in terms of where they have emissions in other areas. Financing is really key. Developing countries really need sufficient financing in place in order to accelerate that transition. I suppose there's kind of obvious things around kind of sharing knowledge on science policies and kind of best practice, but I think we've got a lot to learn as well in terms of from other countries, and then assessing technology needs and kind of making sure there's sort of good learning and technology transfer on how we adapt and mitigate. And I think kind of ultimately there's a role in terms of supporting climate change international sector policies and plans, so those nationally determined contributions in that COP environment, kind of making sure that we are, developed countries are not funding kind of fossil fuel projects and making the problem worse, but supporting countries to sort of transform their economies away from that and enabling and supporting that clean energy investment. So, I think those are some of the main things.
Thank you. And to bring it into the financial industry, we've already just spoken a bit about that macro stewardship, of course, but Bronwyn, what might be our duty as part of the financial industry to help developing countries become climate resilient?
I think this is a really important question, sort of how they put it into practice. For me, the finance sector has sort of three main skills. So one is really about understanding assets. So they've got a lot of data and research skills that they can really apply to, I think, understanding this broader context. Usually they've probably looked at things with maybe a thinner lens, start to widen that, start to integrate some of those climate things first that you might have a stronger understanding of, but then those wider, also then those gender-related issues, race and ethnicity, like how can you bring in more understanding to the asset decisions that you're making, so that you've got that really great data and you can start to share that and start to integrate it into the decisions that they're making. So I think that ability to integrate is also one of the key things that the financial sector can do. They're really good at taking data and knowledge and turning it into something that's sort of decision useful. So how do you express it back to, say, committees who are making decisions, or back out in the reports that you're providing as notes? So there's a lot of ways that they can also then communicate back out. And for me, that then gives sort of that third piece, which is, well, if you're communicating it back out, you can use it then to create new and interesting financial structures. So how can you work with governments? How can you work with other parts of the finance sector in sort of odd new ways between, say, insurance and investment, to be able to put more money into new places that really need it, to be able to kind of bring that full cycle back to, okay, then you can actually use your data again to see how things have improved and assess those changes to keep it rolling forward. So I see the industry really has a lot of skill sets that are much more generic than they might realise, and they can take them into these new spaces and really contribute
Oh, brilliant. So think about our skill set more broadly and apply it in different ways to support there. Thank you. So policymakers have been paying increasing attention to the hidden and deep-rooted barriers to women's empowerment. However, progress is slow and major environmental, economic and social challenges threaten to reverse the trend, unfortunately. So key findings from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, highlight that we have widely spread discriminatory social institutions with a mixed picture of progress and setbacks. We need to acknowledge that people's sexual and reproductive health and rights are fundamental to achieving gender equality. And we need to include and empower women to make the world more climate resilient, as we've spoken about earlier as well. Paddy, what, if anything, can Aviva do to influence government in these areas?
Yeah, well, I think the good news is we do have a voice and we can have impact, and that is one of the privileges of being a large financial institution. But I think that comes from, I suppose what I've noticed in 6 years here is where we have the most impact in terms of influencing government policy, there's probably, it's almost like it's a tiered thing. So basically, first of all, you've got to make sure your own house is in order. So you've got to be, if you want to engage with government and ask them to do something, you've got to make sure that what you're doing is best practice. And I think, we can be proud of what we're doing here, both on climate change and on gender equality. I massively benefited from something like our equal parental leave policy, which I think has been increasingly imitated now. But at the time that it was introduced about 5 or 6 years ago, sort of full paid equal parental leave for men and women was genuinely sector leading. So you've got to have your own policies in place. Same on net zero. We've got a fantastic net zero policy. I can't tell you the number of times that basically gets me access to a really interesting policy discussion with an influential policymaker, because I can say to them before we start, look, did you know that Aviva's got pretty much the best net zero ambition in the business? Obviously, there's a greenwashing team that I need to make sure that we do have a very, very good net zero plan for 2040. And so you've basically got, that's the fundamental, that's your foundation. Then when you build on that, I think a lot of that begins in your practices as a business, then in your outreach. So I'm thinking particularly what we're doing as investors, our own stewardship activities. So we've kind of talked about that. And then finally, once you've built that groundwork, you can go into government and say, look, we're doing absolutely everything that we can in terms of our own internal practices and in what we're doing as an investor, as an insurer, etc. Therefore, we say to you, we still don't see the progress we need to see on some of these issues. Have you considered, and then you can insert your policy change recommendation. And again, particularly where we're most effective is where it's policy where we can show the link to our business. So on climate change, for example, they often do listen to us when it comes to sort of making recommendations for how can we increase private sector investment in climate solutions in the UK and elsewhere, because as well as that credibility, we've also got the expertise and the direct experience. And so that's usually quite a fruitful discussion. And similarly, our general insurance business has been running a really exciting policy-focused campaign on flooding. So again, where you're talking to government about the solutions that are needed for flooding and for protecting people, protecting communities. And again, women are more, even in the UK, are more adversely impacted by flooding for some similar reasons to the ones we described before. And so that's a really powerful campaign, because it's obvious to government if a big general insurer like Aviva comes in and says, look, we've got some proposals about flooding, there's a natural connection there. So it's not just like they're perceiving us as grandstanding on just sort of general issues, although we can do a bit of grandstanding if we want, but where we're most impactful are those issues where we can draw a direct line to our business and what we do as an insurer and what we do as an investor. So that's how we try and do it. And I think, we punch above our weight when it comes to some of this stuff.
That's good. Leading by example. And
I hope
all that,
so, yeah.
To stick with the link into our business, so climate change is going to create an increasingly volatile world, and as a business, insurance business, we are obviously underwriting risks, etc. So Bronwyn, managing risks and uncertainties are part and parcel of the financial industry. How is Ortec Finance managing this climate volatility?
Okay, so we support the finance industry in what I would say is one of their key methods for understanding risk and uncertainty in providing climate scenarios. So we use our economic scenario generator to go look and understand what are the possible pathways that might unfold into the future. How do you get to 1.5? What would that world potentially look like? Whereas also, like, what do those higher degrees start to do? What happens to, say, those sovereign bonds that we were talking about earlier, and that GDP? And it's, whilst not the perfect measure, a very good understanding of how our economy is changing and evolving to see what that world might look like. So I think that's the key method that the finance sector's really got it to hand. And I think the way it's also evolving at the moment, where you've got public scenarios, so things that are coming from the Network for Greening the Financial System or from the International Energy Agency, where people are sort of leaning in and going, look, we'll help you build capacity. We'll provide you some of guidance on what these scenarios might look like in the future. We can then sort of apply those. But there is a risk there, I will be honest, of also things like groupthink. If everyone picks up the same version of the future, that's also got its own troubles attached to it. So we also help to build some alternative views. You're looking at what, say, the IPCC puts out and some alternative academic spaces. There's a lot of wonderful research going into this that I think the finance industry also can tap into and really sort of update and broaden the scenarios that they're looking at. And yeah, so that's one of the things we do, and I really enjoy.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. To go to a little bit of a smaller scale, we all have been talking about cost of living crisis, which I believe is a topic that you're particularly passionate about as well, which is affecting our day-to-day choices really in our financial investments and the things we choose to buy or not buy, and that actually is putting insurance business a little bit at risk in some respects, because it might become increasingly untenable to have an insurance policy, for example, for people like you and me, or even people that we don't know. But so how can we future-proof our essential services like at Aviva so that we can continue to support everyone, all people, particularly those at higher risk of adverse climate change impacts?
Yeah, so I mean, cost of living is something that we've been looking at a lot at WWF, and I suppose it's really important that we're looking at solutions that address cost of living and climate hand in hand. There's some really great examples around kind of improving the quality of people's homes, to moving away from volatile fossil fuels to more clean renewable energy. They have kind of that benefit in terms of climate change, but they're also really kind of driving down the cost of energy bills, protecting people in terms of health and pollution and various different things like that. So how we can support people, I suppose, coming back to the topic of this event, women are actually more proportionally affected again by cost of living for many reasons. Women hold 69% of low paid and insecure jobs, and often have the kind of additional burden where they can't increase their hours due to kind of childcare responsibilities. And I think kind of the cost of childcare has also gone up significantly, even before the cost of living crisis. It's been an issue in the UK that's been going up with inflation. And in the UK alone, women took home, on average, just under £600 less a month than men in 2022. So I suppose the inequalities we've already been talking about are sort of even more exacerbated with that cost of living crisis. And I think as well, kind of looking at women are often the shock absorbers of poverty. So they tend to still, sadly, around the world, have the main responsibility for the purchase and preparation of food for their children and families, and for the management of budgets, particularly in low-income households. There's a lot of statistics around that. And I think some of the areas we maybe haven't touched on as much, but there's the kind of racial inequalities within that as well. So Runnymede produced a report last year that showed, against the backdrop of the current cost of living crisis, Black and minority ethnic people are 2.5 times more likely to be in poverty than white people. So, and that particularly impacts women. And I think other groups that are really impacted by this disability, there are already a third, I think, of disabled workers live in extreme poverty and are having to cut back on food and heating. So the cost of living crisis are really sort of accentuating some of these inequalities. So yeah, I think I haven't quite answered your question in terms of how we future-proof our essential services, but I suppose from WWF's perspective, I think it's really, really essential that we are looking at what are the policies and the mechanisms that really protect these low-income households. And energy, for me, is a really good example of where there's so much more we could be doing now. Yeah. The UK has some of the worst housing quality across the EU. And so making sure that we are prioritising these people and making sure we have the solutions that address climate and cost of living and gender are going to be really important in terms of the future trajectory.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. In the interest of time, I think we've got about 4 minutes left. We open up to the audience for questions. So from Gavin in Sheffield, just wanted to say how pleased I am that we are having this discussion. So thank you. As a father to a little girl myself, do you think that enough is being taught in schools regarding climate change? I'll go to
I'm happy to pick that one up.
You go for it.
Only because we have a youth and education team at WWF.
Oh, brilliant.
And have a lot of ambassadors, youth ambassadors, to try and really champion and integrate more what we can do with school children across all different ages. And actually, I've just been brought into a really interesting project called Cohort 2040, which is looking at what are the skills and the qualities that we need to, I suppose, entrain into the younger generation so that they can remain resilient in the kind of future that we're expecting to move into. And I went to a really interesting session where we had to rank these skills, which was extremely hard because they all felt really important. But I think what I found so inspirational about that project is there are some really amazing people thinking about, we know that there's a lot of interest from younger generations and a lot of what we're trying to do is making sure we're leaving the world in a good state for them. So projects like Cohort 2040 and some of the work we're doing at WWF is trying to really make sure we're integrating that from a young age and making sure we've got those core skills, but also training for the right jobs of the future and making sure we have those champions and those leaders of the future to tackle those climate and nature crises.
Oh, brilliant. That sounds like a good curriculum to get your daughter enrolled on, Gav. So hopefully we'll see that.
Can I quickly add? The other thing that's giving me hope at the moment too is I'm also a fellow at the University of Cambridge, and the number of sort of adult learners who are coming in looking to reskill, to modify their own career choices and to sort of be a more sustainability part of their work or to take it on in a full-time way is just expanding and exploding. So I'm really excited about also the formal education for adults and professionals that's really pushing through, I think, going to be a deeper skill set for the workforce in 2040 to use.
Oh, brilliant. So it goes over multiple generations there, Thank you. All right, 1 minute left. I'll be really quick. Estee Mockridge asked, how can individuals get the government and local councils to make tackling climate change a higher priority so they meet their net zero target? Who wants to take it?
I'm happy to take that one. It's a subject close to my heart. I think just make yourself heard, because I think we've seen, even in recent weeks on things like the ULEZ, it's not always the majority of people who are necessarily making themselves heard on this issue. So write to your MP, talk to your business, talk to your school, talk to your local council, join a political party, join a group like WWF. So there's so many ways to make yourself heard, and you'd be surprised actually. So I talk to a lot of politicians, and it's really important to them what their local constituents think. They will often overweight a single letter from a local constituent compared to, a big campaign from a group of people that they've never met. So, the political system does work. Sometimes you just have to actually use it and engage with it. So make yourself heard, talk to your MP, talk to your local council.
Yeah.
Be persistent, yeah.
Yeah, completely agree. And they say that, we often speak to politicians and they want to hear more on climate change. We've actually got a live MP action at the moment for this point, specifically to try and encourage people to write into their MPs about climate change and how important it is. So,
bring it up on the agenda. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Sadly, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you very much to all the panellists for coming along and sharing your insights. Thank you. And thank you to you for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.